Good evening to all in the Asia Pacific. Good afternoon to those joining us from Europe and the Middle East. And a very good morning to those in the Americas. A warm welcome to this launch of the 2021 Asia Pacific Regional Security Assessment. My name is Lynn Kwok, and I'm Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellow for Asia Pacific Security. Together with the former Executive Director of the IISS Asia Office, Dr. Tim Huxley, I am editor of the Asia Pacific Regional Security Assessment. I'll also be your chair for this session. The Asia Pacific Regional Security Assessment examines key regional security issues relevant to the policy-focused discussions at the IISS Shangri-La Dialogue, an annual defense summit the Institute convenes. The dossier is published each year in association with the dialogue. And although the dialogue had to be cancelled this year, Tim and I, as well as the new executive director of our Asia office, James Crabtree, hope that the regional security assessment will nevertheless continue to promote debate among key decision makers and thinkers in the region. Many of you would have been guests at the dialogue and are joining us today. We thank you for your continued support of the IISS Shangri-La Dialogue process, and I'm so happy to see that we have many friends of the IISS online today. Now, this 8th volume of the Asia Pacific Regional Security Assessment includes 12 chapters on diverse themes. You'll be hearing from some of the authors later, but as in previous years, this year's Regional Security Assessment includes not just in-depth analysis of some of the most pressing challenges to security in the Asia Pacific, but a wealth of data in graphical form. This is a map from Kanti Bajpayi's chapter on India's emerging grand strategy, showing the locale of confrontations between India and China in 2020. This map from Franz Stefan Geddes' chapter on emerging technologies and future conflict in the Asia Pacific shows the range of Taiwanese medium and long-range air defense systems. And for those of you wondering about the UK's commitment to the Indo-Pacific and persistence of Royal Naval warships, Alessio Patalano's chapter on the United Kingdom and Indo-Pacific security shows deployments of Her Majesty's ships to the Indo-Pacific from January 2018 to October 2020. Now, I'm delighted that a number of authors who wrote chapters for the Regional Security Assessment are with us for this launch. Amidst great power rivalry, a new US administration, and increasing interest from powers beyond the region, it's a particularly opportune time to be having this discussion. Now, I propose we proceed as follows. I'll engage speakers in a moderated discussion for about half the session, and we'll then turn to Q&A. If you'd like to ask a question, and I hope many of you will, please type your question on the Q&A button box at the bottom right-hand of your screen. Please let us know to whom your question is addressed, as well as your affiliation. It's with great pleasure that I now turn to introducing my speakers. Now, joining us virtually are Ashley Townsend, Director of Foreign Policy and Defense at the United States Studies Center at the University of Sydney. Welcome, Ashley. And from the research staff of the Institute, Robert Ward, Japan Chair and Director of Geoeconomics and Strategy, as well as Sarah Rain, Consulting Senior Fellow for Geopolitics and Strategy. Welcome. Now, with me in this room, Dr. Kanti Bajpai, who's directly to my right. Kanti is Wilmer Professor of Asian Studies at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. And we also have Drew Thompson joining us on my far right. He's visiting Senior Research Fellow, also at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Thank you both for joining me in person. Drew, let's start with you. Your chapter examined US-China decoupling and its security implications for Southeast Asia. How does decoupling or disengaging fit into the broader concerns about the US and China clashing? And where do you expect the trajectory of US-China relations to go?
Certainly. Thank you, Lynn. Decoupling was certainly a buzzword in 2020, but I think it's a very problematic concept. Neither the US nor China embraced it as a declared objective. And China certainly used the term pejoratively, accusing the United States of seeking to pursue decoupling, even as China pursued many similar policies and engaged in behavior that one could consider to be decoupling. So decoupling as a concept lacks a commonly understood definition. So in the words of a former US Chief Justice, we don't really have a good definition for it, but I know it when I see it. So I would describe China's objective as really not so much decoupling, but, and it's not simply as natural as, say, achieving self-reliance, which has been a stated policy for China in the past. But Beijing also knows that achieving absolute objectives such as decoupling is really not necessarily in its interest because it would be costly, but also it would not be able to accrue some of the benefits from engagement, such as access to capital and technology. So there's still benefits for China to gain from it, even as it seeks to pursue an objective that I would call fortification, where basically their effort is to build autonomy and resilience against external threats. So that notion of fortification is really integral to Beijing's industrial policies, and it's increasingly central to the political society where Xi Jinping has sought to place the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, in the very dominant social, political, and economic force in the country. And that really pushes non-party interests as well as external interests to the margins of China. So the Trump administration also in 2020, they took very significant steps to confront China in areas where it felt that the bilateral relationship was not advantageous to the United States, or where they sought to protect themselves from predation or the risk of coercion. So that effort on the part of the United States was also very much an all-of-government effort to approach competition, much as China does. And it's really based on a principle of achieving resiliency and diversification. And on the Trump administration's part, it really involved empowering the Departments of Treasury and Commerce to both scrutinize inbound investments as well as external flows of technology. The Department of Justice was also heavily involved in combating intellectual property theft and espionage. So Washington, furthermore, also took significant steps to address military-civil fusion by naming and identifying military-linked companies and then cutting them off from access to U.S. capital. So all of those moves could be considered or interpreted as part of an effort to decouple, but neither country really identified their actions as an act of decoupling, because really decoupling, like engagement, is more of the means rather than the ends to a policy. So regarding, Lynn, your question on the trajectory of decoupling, I think it's pretty obvious that Xi Jinping's overall approach to governance and his acute perception of external threats to the party very much makes the increase in integration with the West, the United States, very difficult to conceive of. The Biden administration has also very much embraced many of the policies that it inherited from the Trump administration, and it's very committed to compete with China as they define it, and President Biden's also backed by a bipartisan concession primarily on Capitol Hill. So I think the Biden administration also enacted some early efforts to establish what they called results-oriented engagement with Beijing, but they were met with very frosty and defensive interlocutors that indicated that Beijing wasn't willing to compromise or find common ground with the United States, or even acknowledge the U.S.'s degree of dissatisfaction with the lack of reciprocity in the bilateral relationship. So Kurt Campbell declared in May that the period that was broadly described as engagement has come to an end. And I think that pretty much sums up what the trajectory of U.S.-China decoupling will be.
So it looks like it's going to be more difficulties ahead in the US-China relationship. And of course, this poses problems for smaller countries in the region who have urged the United States and China not to ask them to choose. You touch on this on your chapter. But even for larger countries like Japan, I think what struck me about your chapter, Robert, was that you highlight in your chapter that US-China rivalry is making it very complicated for Japan to reconcile the importance of China's market to the Japanese economy with its critical security ties with the United States. That said, I think more than anyone else, the challenge for Japan is not just about the dilemma that US-China rivalry puts Japan in, but also China's actions in the region. Could you tell me how China's actions in the region are catalyzing Japanese security policy, Robert?
Well, first, congratulations to you, Lynn, and the team on a fantastic output, a fantastic book, some great scholarship in it, and I sort of heartily recommend it to all those who are listening. And thank you for having me on this great panel as well. Good to hear some sober analysis from Drew on decoupling too, because the debate around decoupling is often far too shrill, so it's good to see some realism there. As you said, China has been the major catalyst for changes, really quite significant changes to Japan's security and foreign policy. As I argue in my piece, it's not the only catalyst, of course. Others include developments in the US, which is obviously very important for Japan, as well as Abe Shinzo, the previous prime minister, his ideological aims after his return as prime minister in 2012. Importantly as well, this rethink predates Abe. There are many triggers for the rethink in Japan on China before Abe, including China overtaking Japan as the world's second largest economy in 2010, and of course the great watershed event for Japanese understanding of potential Chinese coercion, economic coercion, which was the temporary ban on exports of rare earths to Japan from China in 2010 in retaliation for an increase in the tension around the territorial dispute. But Abe's second term as prime minister from 2012 to 2020 really moved the debate in Japan on at an astonishingly fast speed, so Cholima speed, as Kim Jong-un might say, certainly at least by the standards of previous years in Japan. And of course, the second term of Abe overlapped with the start of Xi Jinping's time in office as well. So there's a nice sort of symmetry there, if you like. I'm going to group these changes into four buckets. The first in Japan is institutional, or what I call framework changes. So rattle through the highlights of these. 2013, creation of Japan's first National Security Council. 2013, release of Japan's first National Security Strategy. Also, same year update to Japan's National Defense Program guidelines and revision to the Medium-Term Defense Program. 2014, the start of constitutional changes in Japan to allow limited collective self-defense, and the enabling legislation for this passed by the Diet in 2015. Also, 2015 revised guidelines for US-Japan Defense Cooperation, the first such since 1997. These included enhanced interoperability between Japan and the US, peacetime cooperation between Japan and the US for the first time, cooperation in new domains for the first time, and of course, very, very importantly, sort of the global scope of this alliance. And in 2018, another update of the National Defense Program guidelines. The second in my four items in my bucket are capability improvements. Japan's been increasing the pace of its military build-up under the defense budget's under 1% of GDP traditionally, but Japan's GDP has obviously been expanding. And there's a very interesting article the other day in the Nikkei, one of Japan's biggest newspapers, of course, in which the defense minister, Kishi Nobuo, hinted that if the circumstances required it, that Japan might smash through that 1% limit. The last two in my bucket are coalitions. Japan's been very active over the last 10 years in building coalitions in all sorts of areas. We'll talk about the economic coalitions in a bit, I think. But in the defense security sphere, Japan's been strengthening relations with like-minded countries in the region, notably Australia and India through the Quad. Interestingly, the Quad momentum has really accelerated since Suga took office. So contrary to the expectations of many as Suga was taking office last year, some of his greatest successes, actually, I would argue, have been in the foreign policy space. And finally, and really interesting, I think, for the region, is Japan's changing tone on Taiwan. We've seen this a number of times over the last, since this year started. The 2+2, of course, earlier in 2021, the reference to the interest of both parties in stability in the Taiwan Strait. The similar reference in the Suga-Biden summit, of course. And again, I come back to this interview by Kishi in the Nikkei, in which he referred to sort of problems in Taiwan as also being problems for Japan, because of course of the proximity of Taiwan to the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands down there in that very contested bit of the world. So lots of stuff going on the security front, of course. The big question, is sort of my final point, is how fast will the pace of change be going forward? Under Abe, it was very fast, but Abe was given an enabler because of his political stability and his longevity. He could fight election after election and won. I suspect how fast the pace of the debate goes in Japan will depend to a large extent on the political strength whoever holds office as Prime Minister.
Thanks so much, Robert. You mentioned the watershed event in Japanese policy towards China. Our other author, Ashley, also mentions in his chapter another watershed event, and that's the Australia 2020 Defence Strategic Update. What does the document say, Ashley, or imply about how Australia views China and the United States, and what's behind some of that thinking? Ashley?
Thanks, Lynn, and thanks very much to my colleagues and friends here on this panel at IISS for the invitation this evening. As you say, Lynn, the now almost 1 year old Australian 2020 Defence Strategic Update really was a watershed document in Australian strategic policy terms. And the reason I say that is not just because of the fact that it was launched amidst the pandemic at the beginning of a still ongoing campaign of Chinese economic coercion against Australia in terms by the Prime Minister that were couched similarly to the existential threats that the region faced and that Australia faced rather in the 90s and 30s and 40s. But even perhaps more important than that, it's the first time since the 1950s really that Australia has redefined its own defence policy in terms of its force structure planning and its strategic policy planning in genuinely regional terms. That is to say that Australia is no longer pursuing a direct defence of Australia continentalist mindset, as some Australian strategists, prominent though they may be, have advocated in recent years. Nor is Australia going to continue to pursue the sort of post-9/11 global order defending role that it played as a coalition partner with the United States in the Middle East. But instead, Australia is defining its own national security in terms that relate to the quality and the nature of the Indo-Pacific regional order. And that is that part of the Indo-Pacific stretching from the northeastern Indian Ocean through mainland and maritime Southeast Asia and onwards through Papua New Guinea to the Southwest Pacific. That is a really big change in Australian strategic policy history. I think it's predominantly motivated by what we might say are balance of power calculations when it comes to Canberra's assessment of the regional strategic environment. As I said, the Prime Minister used extremely stark terms in launching the document. And in fact, if you read the 2020 Defence Strategic Update, it very quickly gives rise to a sense of strategic emergency when it comes to looking at the Indo-Pacific. And indeed, that is a term that's used frequently in Canberra these days. Insofar as China is concerned, there are the familiar concerns that you've seen since the white papers of the early 2000s that talk about the progress that China is making with regards to its conventional military capabilities and its development of new military technologies and their impact or their capacity that they could impact on Australian continental security. Those are still there, but they're now being put in much more urgent terms. And in fact, the term is used in the 2020 Defence Strategic Update that Australia no longer has what it has always had, which is a sense of a 10-year warning time for any direct threat against Australia or its interests. And dissolving that with regards to our defence planning guidelines is again another big step that points to Australian assessments that China really does have the power and potentially over time the intentions to cause problems for Australia in the Indo-Pacific. But it's not all about the conventional military balance when it comes to China. It's as much about the grey zone threats and the grey zone coercion that China is already using, not just against Australia in the current economic coercion phase of the relationship, which has indeed hit rock bottom, but vis-a-vis multiple countries across the region where China is using disinformation, it's using political intimidation, it's using trade leverage in order to shift and try and get regional countries to not take positions on issues that matter to China that it doesn't want them to take. So that part of the Defence Strategic Update really does couch China as a threat to Australian interests in current terms. When it comes to the United States, once again, the balance of power calculations, I think, loom large in Australian strategic assessments. And you really have to go back to the 2017 Australian Foreign Policy White Paper to unlock what's really going on in the current document. The 2017 White Paper looked at the Indo-Pacific in terms of alignment and power dynamics and made the point, or the observation really, that China will overtake the United States by the end of this decade, both in GDP as well as it already has, purchasing power terms as a major economy in the region. But since then, you've seen the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister make comments about the end of the unipolar moment. You've seen the outgoing Secretary of the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade look at the United States position and argue that, in fact, the United States won't be able to exercise leadership in the way it once could. And all of this, including Australian assessments about the sort of underpinnings, technological, military, political underpinnings of American power, come together to make one key point for Australian policymakers, which is this: the United States won't be able to uphold a favourable balance of power in the Indo-Pacific by itself, and therefore Australia, along with Japan, India and other regional countries, will increasingly need to play a complementary role to the United States in order to maintain, broadly speaking, a balance of power that can manage and constrain Chinese adventurism, as indeed we expect that to continue over time. The final point, and I'll leave you all with this, is that this shift to a competitive US-China strategic dynamic, much as in the case with Japan, does also pose problems for Australia. And in many ways, like countries in Southeast Asia, Australia wants the region to find a settling point. It wants to avoid conflict and confrontation between the US and China, even as it is deeply invested in the United States' success. And so Australia, like many others in the region, are looking for ways to mitigate a confrontational direction in US-China relations, even as they're looking to contribute to a stable balance of power.
Thanks so much, Ashley. And of course, you mentioned the desire of all countries in the region, well, most countries in the region, to avoid confrontation, even whilst they might be concerned about certain aspects of Chinese or even the United States behavior. And I think that's an important point to highlight. I think moving to Kanti now, quite apart from the 2020 Defence Strategic Update that Australia issued last year, we also saw another significant event, and that, of course, was the confrontation between India and China at the border, the Ladakh crisis. So what has the crisis meant for India's China strategy, and can we consider that an event that catalyzed India's foreign policy and security policy vis-a-vis China?
Yeah, thanks very much, Lynn. And I think you used the right word. While the others were talking, I wrote down defining moment here. And I think the crisis in Ladakh in the summer of 2020, looking back on it, we're going to see that it was a defining moment. To appreciate that, I think one has to kind of look at the trend in India-China relations over a long period of time. And essentially, India's always been conscious that China is a bigger power and a superior power, and has alternated between two responses to China. The first, going back to the 1950s, has been negotiation. After the 1962 war, it moved to a second paradigm, which was trying to balance Chinese power. That was succeeded by the end of the Cold War with a return to a negotiation paradigm in dealing with China. And I think from 2008, somewhat prior to the crisis, of course, some years prior, the increasing incidence of Chinese incursions into India began to move India towards a power balancing paradigm once again. And I think the tipping point really was reached with the crisis in Ladakh in the summer of 2020. And essentially, India seems now to be embarked on a grand strategy that really emphasizes two components, balancing internally, that is through one's own efforts, and balancing externally, that is partnering with other powers to try and balance China. So I want to say a few words about both forms of balancing, and to leave you with a thought about some of the challenges that come out of these two tracks of internal balancing and external balancing. And just to give the game away, I think internal balancing, as the audience will appreciate, takes quite a long time to achieve. Economically and militarily, to build your capabilities isn't done overnight. But pallying up to or partnering with external powers that count is probably quicker to do. And I think this poses a bit of a dilemma for India, which has never been very happy being part of a putative alliance, but is being pushed in that direction because of its own internal constraints. So let me say something about both the internal balancing efforts and also the external balancing efforts before ending my remarks. On the internal balancing, there are two components. There's the economic kind of rehabilitation of India, but also the military. And I think in both cases, there have been two components again. So there's been a kind of economic baring of the teeth against China and a military baring of the teeth against China in the wake of the crisis. But there's also been an effort to build capacity economically and build military capacity for the longer term. So just a few words on both of those. I think in terms of the baring teeth economically, the word decoupling has been mentioned, and India did its own form of decoupling. So it took some steps to raise tariffs vis-a-vis Chinese goods. It made it difficult for Chinese companies to invest in the Indian economy, and probably most notoriously, it banned a whole bunch of Chinese apps, about 100 of them, that Indian consumers and young people enjoyed, such as TikTok. So that was quite telling, and that was kind of the baring teeth economically. I think in the capability building economically, India has, under its so-called Atmanirbhar Abhiyan, has pushed through a series of reforms in the last year and a half. Agricultural reforms, which have been quite controversial, the paring down of public spending in certain areas, but increasing liquidity in other areas, reforms in terms of the public sector enterprises, trying to sell them off, and so on. So I think that's the picture on the economic side, a certain amount of baring teeth and a certain number of fundamental kinds of reforms for the longer term. On the military side, I think the baring teeth are quite interesting. For instance, India carried out 9 missile tests in September, October of 2020 in the wake of the most serious part of the crisis in a period of 35 days. A whole range of these missiles were tested, unprecedented, I think, in Indian strategic history. India also pushed some of its boats into the South China Sea to send a message that on the naval side, India would be a bit more active and look China in the eye. But on the long-term capability side, just as it emphasized self-reliance or this Atmanirbharta in economics, India has also started to emphasize self-reliance on the military side. Recently, in the wake of the crisis, it notified a list, presented a list of 100 defense items that it would now like to produce within the next 5 years on its own, sometimes in collaboration, in licensing collaboration with foreigners, but substantially with its own private sector players and its own public defense sector enterprises. And so we'll see how that goes, but India certainly laid down a kind of plan for the next 5, perhaps 10 years of military self-reliance. One should remember, India is one of the biggest importers of arms anywhere in the world, so this turn is significant as well. Coming to the external balance, I mean, I think here the story is more straightforward, but as noted by Robert Ward and others, there's been a quickening of the pace of the Quad. And so India, which has been ambivalent to some extent about the Indo-Pacific idea, it's sometimes been warmer towards it and sometimes been a bit cooler towards it. I think in the wake of the crisis, it certainly started to mouth the Indo-Pacific vocabulary far more, and it's kicked up the level of meetings to which it's committed itself to foreign ministers level and so on, to show its much greater commitment. But I think the real action has probably been in sort of the military arm of the Indo-Pacific, which is the Quad. And here I think Indian participation has been at a higher level again, but the discussions have been far more substantive about what India can do militarily. And I think this is again a sort of the baring of the teeth towards China. But I suppose more significantly, of course, India's taken the opportunity finally to declare itself a much closer partner of the United States. And I'll just point to a couple of things there and then close my remarks. I mean, essentially, India finished or signed the fourth of the four foundational agreements that it had been tarrying over with the Americans, and that was done in the wake of the crisis. It's also now really got on board the 2+2 meetings, that is, the defense and foreign ministers meeting their counterparts much more regularly. And of course, American arms imports have increased at some pace, I think, in this period. And more generally, I think, India has continued to increase its arms imports as part of its external balancing. So I think that's the broad picture. I just want to end with this thought again to underline it, which is that internal balancing is great, and I think a country like India, which in its strategic culture has always stressed a degree of independence and standing up for itself, but in the short term, when you're confronting China, you need friends and partners, and I think India's really having to struggle with the idea of committing to a coalition, and it's not great at that, but it's, I think, learning how to cope and commit. So let me just stop there. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Kanti. And you mentioned the baring of the teeth. Sarah wrote a chapter on NATO and its China policy. So NATO is not quite baring its teeth to China, and yet it's concerned. Sarah, can you tell us why NATO, whose traditional sphere of influence has been outside the Asia-Pacific region, why it's concerned about China and developments in the Asia-Pacific?
Thank you very much, Lynn, indeed, for having me on. This is a concern that has been developing slowly and quietly for a while, where we've seen a big push in the wake of the 2019 NATO summit that specifically for the first time highlighted China and the potential challenges that China posed the collective security agreement. And Kanti, has already talked about a watershed moment, and I think we might look back on 2019 with the agreement to finally get the Allies talking about China as one of those watershed moments. We'll know more on the 14th of June when we see the details of the NATO 2030 package as announced, where we've heard from Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg yesterday will be deeply connected to the discussion on how NATO should go about working and considering the challenges that China poses. I mean, when he launched this package, these discussions in June 2020 of last year, the Secretary General pretty much answered your question, Lynn, by saying the following, that China is coming closer to NATO, both geographically, in the Arctic, in Africa, and physically, for example, in terms of investments in alliance infrastructure and the potential security implications this brings, and also in cyberspace. And he highlighted how China is working more closely, including militarily, of course, with NATO's traditional and still very much primary target of concern, namely Russia. So the idea as then presented wasn't so much about NATO's focus shifting to China, but rather about making sure to include China in consideration of NATO's area of focus. And that's an important way of presenting this for bringing and sort of cultivating Allied unity. But of course it is a little bit disingenuous because one of the key packages that we're going to see in NATO 2030 will actually be developing and building on these global partnerships that NATO has been cultivating that, of course, inevitably bring it into a greater presence in the Indo-Pacific. But ultimately, I think this NATO attention on China is pretty much fair enough because it's sort of illogical to talk about promoting resilience in NATO member states and in NATO partner countries and taking a whole of society approach to promoting resilience, and then not talk about China's investments in critical digital, technological, physical infrastructure in NATO member states. You can't argue for an alliance to be stronger politically, which is the aim of this NATO 2030 package, or one of the aims of it, or for the alliance to strengthen its global partnerships, and then not address the challenge that China presents, whether with regard to alliance cohesion or the centrality that China plays in the strategic thinking of some NATO member states and many NATO global partners. You know, Robert talked in his chapter, and we've just discussed it sort of here, where lots of the speakers have alluded to the sort of escalation of Chinese strategic opportunism, I think is what Robert called it. And I think that this adventurism has helped galvanize support for a more active look in China in many different forums, and NATO's no exception. And to finish with, one thing I do think is interesting is that the values piece, of course, has deep historical roots in NATO. And that values piece is very much coming back to the fore now as NATO looks again at the China challenge, because perhaps ultimately, as I say in my chapter, it's unsurprising that a communist country that is now more actively promoting an alternative set of values, possessing the most populous military forces in the world, supported by this world's second largest defense budget, a country that is investing heavily in military modernization, including in missiles that can reach NATO countries. It's unsurprising that a country with these characteristics is attracting NATO attention. To me, that seems entirely logical.
Thanks, Sarah. Let's stay with you for a moment. You talked about the challenges that China presents to cohesion within NATO. I'll turn to Drew in a second to look at the challenges China poses to ASEAN cohesion and ASEAN centrality. But Sarah, to what extent do you think NATO has a coherent strategy for responding to developments in the region and the sort of challenges that it foresees itself facing with China in its area of focus?
Sure. I mean, building a coherent strategy is clearly very much a work in progress, to put it politely. But we will see the next building blocks of these efforts to build a more coherent strategy in the package of measures that are put forward as part of NATO 2030. And ultimately, I don't think it's particularly surprising that we're going to have to struggle on this complex, nuanced issue to create some sort of consensus, both within and across 30 different member states. I mean, we're used now to talking about cross-party consensus on China in the US, but for a multitude of different reasons, we're just not there yet in terms of most other NATO states. Now, ultimately, the way around this in true diplomatic fashion is by fudging it. And there's actually a certain amount of productive fudging that can be done. We talk, for example, of China as a strategic competitor and a partner. We talk about how the CCP's international policies present both challenges and opportunities. The NATO Secretary General has gone out of his way to emphasize that NATO, and I quote, NATO does not see China as the new enemy. And I think we're going to see more of this in the package of measures in the coming days. So I don't know for certain, but I would be very surprised if NATO 2030 doesn't have something about climate change in it. Not only because climate change matters, of course, but also because it helps that members can also point to areas of cooperation and opportunity with China. You know, I saw Jens Stoltenberg talking yesterday about how China will feature heavily in this NATO 2030 package and how consensus, he claims, has been secured. And I would, you know, let's wait and see the detail, but superficial consensus isn't actually that hard to do. And I want to just give one example of that. Let's take promoting the rules-based order, which is something I think we'll see in the package of measures that comes out, where we can say that NATO member states agree. So yes, there's consensus, and yes, it relates to China. But what happens is China is given different priorities by different partners. So the US can work on NATO, doing more to promote the rules-based order by developing partnerships in the Indo-Pacific. And Eastern NATO member states, Eastern European and Central European NATO member states, can say that NATO is promoting the rules-based order by focusing on working more closely, for example, with NATO accession countries in their region. And perhaps a little cheekily, but Paris, for example, can say that it is doing more promoting the rules-based order as a NATO member state by building up EU capacities and standard setting, which are absolutely fundamental for this debate. So I think we don't have a problem with differing political prioritization. That's a reality. That's a way that you form and build consensus. Everything can be connected back to China, or just some things can be connected back to China. And we start by picking and mixing those themes, because this is a nuanced and complex conversation on an issue that is genuinely concerning, and where, given 2 years ago, NATO was finding it difficult to agree whether it should even mention the words China in its strategic concept, and we were commissioning papers on understanding China better to try and build that dynamic. I suspect that we will find on June the 14th, or when we see the package of measures, that NATO really has come quite a long way on the China debate and on building consensus, albeit that there's a long way still to go. Thank you, Sarah.
Drew, perhaps you'd like to address how well you think ASEAN is faring in terms of having a coordinated approach towards China.
Certainly. I think the first thing to really consider is that you have to distinguish between ASEAN as an organization and individual Southeast Asian states. And I think that's really important, just as a caveat to begin with. And it goes without saying, but it needs to be said, that the state of the US-China relationship is very deeply felt here in Southeast Asia. So I think individual ASEAN states have made it very clear that they do not want to choose between the US and China. And they very much see some of their own internal challenges as inextricably undividable from that US-China dyad. And I would argue that in some cases those linkages between US-China tensions and the challenges felt here in Southeast Asia are maybe a little bit overplayed. But essentially what Southeast Asian states want to see from the United States is basically four things. They want to see predictability and political presence, as well as a certain degree of security presence. They want the US to embrace ASEAN centrality and make it central to its approach to the region. And they also want to see greater US economic engagement in the region. And fourthly, I think ASEAN states generally want to see a much more tempered and less tension-filled US-China relationship. So just because Southeast Asian states want that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to get it. And I increasingly have the sense that Washington sees ASEAN and ASEAN states is very much defined by their negative policies. Basically what ASEAN states won't do. They won't choose sides, or they won't take measures to pressure other countries to deal with intractable problems, such as Myanmar. So for countries in the region that want to get more out of the United States, they may have to make more investments into that bilateral relationship with the US. And I think some of those investments that they could make, or steps they could take, could include matching their private requests of the United States with more public statements of support for a robust and sustained US presence. I think also demonstrating that ASEAN centrality is more than just a slogan is another important measure that they can take. And another issue, I think, is also ASEAN's going to have to figure out how it can complement or at least peacefully coexist with other groupings in the region, such as the Quad, which I think is going to be less inclusive, but potentially more outcome-oriented than ASEAN might be. But back to something concrete like the desire for more US economic engagement to balance China's economic influence. That's a very consistent theme that you hear from states here. And I think increasing U.S. economic investment in the region is not really a function of U.S.-China relations. And I don't think it's also driven by Washington's political preferences. It's really driven by the private sector's risk perceptions and willingness to invest in various markets in Southeast Asia. And that's really a function of those individual countries and their markets' openness and their level of good governance and transparency and infrastructure and an educated workforce and a good regulatory environment and legal system that would encourage and support better trade and investment from the United States. And if those conditions are met, then I think U.S. investment and trade and economic influence in the region grows substantially. But what the U.S. is not it's not China. It's not a state-led economy. So I think ASEAN states have a great deal of agency in that respect, and that they can determine how much to draw the U.S. into the region. And Ashley made a very good point as well about other countries having to step up to maintain that balance of power with China and not just rely on the United States to do the heavy lifting. And I'd argue that doesn't just apply to Australia, Japan, and India, but it also applies to other countries and smaller countries that are invested in upholding that rules-based international order. And I think this is a really key aspect of that agency that Southeast Asian states seek. So I think forcing countries to choose or implying economic coercion against them or linking their own development challenges to the U.S.-China relationship is really somewhat disingenuous. And I think it does those Southeast Asian countries a disservice and denies them that agency that I think they rightly deserve.
Thanks. I think you brought up the very important question of the desire for greater U.S. economic engagement in the region to balance China. I think one country that has particularly understood the critical link between economic security and broader security issues has been Japan. Robert, I was wondering whether you could touch a little very quickly on Japan and how it's deployed economic statecraft in the pursuit of broader geopolitical gains. I think we also have a question that I'll turn to after this on the issue of broader Japan-Australia cooperation, but perhaps you could address that question first, Robert.
Thank you, Lynn. Yes, absolutely. So I argue in my piece that Japan was an early mover in recognizing the overlap between economic security and hard security. And of course, for Japan, this sort of ability to flex its geo-economic endowments is really important because of the constitutional constraints on its ability to wield hard power. And this identification of the overlap, which happened under Abe again, is now mainstream thinking in the West, especially around the resilience portion of this. We will wait and see what they have to say at the G7 as all the leaders descend on beautiful Cornwall, but I'm sure that resilience will play a part of this. But what Japan gets right, I think, which is sort of less present in the resilience debate at the moment, is the need to think about economic statecraft connectivity as well as resilience. And with this in mind, I want to make two main points. The first is to situate Abe's free and open Indo-Pacific vision, concept, policy, call it what you like, FOIP, at the center of Japan's thinking of economic statecraft. So unlike what you may hear, FOIP is not primarily a security construct. It is a tool of economic statecraft, and there are some security underpinnings to this, but it is primarily around economic statecraft. And Sarah talked about the values piece, and some of the most important sort of pillars supporting FOIP are around values. So are very loosely defined. So the promotion of the rule of law, freedom of navigation, promotion of economic prosperity through improving economic and institutional connectivity, and promotion of peace and stability through capacity building and humanitarian assistance. So it does sit in contradistinction to China's BRI, but it depends on Japan, its success depends on Japan building coalitions of the like-minded. So it's about networks rather than the BRI, which is about sort of hub and spokes with China in the middle. from FOIP, we've had, of course, CPTPP, which can be seen in FOIP terms. Again, this is the very most important bit of the CPTPP, in my view, is that it's underpinned by standards and setting aspirational standards for all those members. The UK's membership will be particularly important, less because of the trade effects for the UK, but more because of the geopolitical ballast that the UK will bring. And also very important that CPTPP keeps expanding, given now that we've got RCEP, which I know that those in ASEAN will say this is an ASEAN-driven thing, but having China in the middle of RCEP also does create quite a lot of gravitational pull towards China. So again, I think for the CPTPP, RCEP does present some problems. Also interesting from this sort of FOIP point of view is the expansion of the Quad, now beyond hard security into supply chain resilience, climate change and vaccines as well. The second point, very briefly, about how Japan's thinking about its economic statecraft is around the institutional changes that Abe made at home. Most notably, the interagency National Security Secretariat Economics Division, which was launched in 2020. This, I think, is the NSS's biggest unit, as I said, interagency, so it brings all of Japan's famously fractured experts together, at least in theory. But I think the really interesting thing about the NSS is how broad its remit is around economic statecraft. So it includes thinking on digital currencies, as well as how to boost Japan's representation in international institutions, which of course are really important for standard setting and so on. So I think just to conclude, I think this Japan's institutional changes, I think they also offer a model for other countries, other medium, smaller powers to think about policy in a way that brings economics and security together, because they do go hand in hand now.
So much, Robert. I think I'd like to stay on the issue of economics and security for a bit. The flip side, of course, of attempts to woo Southeast Asia with promised economic reward is the economic coercion that we've seen applied to countries like Australia. And this ties in, of course, to a question that one of our audience has asked, Andy Wong from Metis Asia. He asked about, the ability of Australia to be able to sustain itself, or to produce the resilience that it's able to do to kind of respond to to China's economic coercion. I'd like to join this, Ashley, to my question. And so how first has Australia fared in the face of Chinese coercion? And then second, how is Chinese economic coercion affecting Australia's efforts to bolster collective action and regional resilience?
Thanks, Lynn. Look, they're a great set of questions, and not to be cute, but the second one we don't know the answer for some time, but there are some I think cautionary principles to bear in mind. With regards to the former part, how has Australia gone in faring Chinese economic coercion? The answer is basically pretty well. Although we have seen it, and there are various different ways of calculating, like the damage or the exposure to economic coercion, complicated by the fact that so many industries, including international students and tourism, are just not happening in Australia right now. But it's somewhere between 10 and $40 billion US, again, depending on the time frame that you take. But if you look at Australia's ability to find new markets for many of those commodities, in the case of Australian beef, in the case of Australian barley, in the case of timber, you name it, for the most part, Australia has managed to do that. And in fact, you've seen very much a cushioning of the potential effects of Chinese economic coercion with regards to the economic damage itself in the diversification agenda that Australia is now very much championing at a Commonwealth level with regards to strategies to withstand economic coercion going forward. Of course, some industries haven't been targeted and could cause a lot of damage. Iron ore is the big example there, and if indeed China does really decide to try to inflict economic damage rather than just economic coercion, which is really about changing the political decision that the government is taking, then of course it could use the iron ore weapon, but that would also mean it would incur a degree of cost itself, because Australian iron ore, like Australian minerals writ large, are very much world class when it comes to their price and quality on international markets. But that is one direction things could take if they really did deteriorate. On the other hand, you have the industries that might have been significantly affected, but which we don't have data for yet, and that's the case with Chinese tourism and Chinese students. And of course, the Chinese ambassador sort of brazenly here in Australia last year dangled the prospects that China would encourage internationals not to study and not to visit Australia in response to Australia's position on calling for an international inquiry into the origins of COVID-19. Well, that could still come to pass, but then once again the government has many levers in play to incentivize other countries to send their students and other countries to come to Australia for tourism when that indeed reopens. So we'll see. I think the second point to make here, though, is it's not just about Australia. Australia does want to weather the economic damage and has demonstrated an ability to do so. But just as important for Australia is not being seen as an example of a country that is encountering a lot of damage and, if you like, sacrificing itself for standing up for its interests and principles. And on the contrary, it would much prefer to be seen as a country that is able to get through this, to diversify, to withstand the damage, and therefore indirectly incentivize other countries, including those in the region, including those in Southeast Asia, to take, if you like, more brazen steps to stand up for their own interests, come what may, including come what may with regards to Chinese economic coercion. So here, I think the jury is still out. Of course, there have been other countries, as Robert has just spoken about in the case of Japan. Japan has been a country that has been on the receiving line of Chinese economic coercion. South Korea, India, the Philippines. Australia isn't alone, but the scale, intensity, and really suspected permanence of this is something different. So for Australia, success with regards to withstanding economic coercion and building out, Lynn, as you asked, a broader regional resilient strategy, it will really hinge on us being able to communicate to other countries that, in fact, you can get through economic coercion provided you take the right steps at a national level. And of course, there are clearly structural differences with regards to the Australian economy and others in the region that will make that more or less successful for regional countries.
Thank you, Ashley. I think I'll go to the question posed by Bryce Wakefield now. He's asked the following. We've seen Japan and Australia grow increasingly close in the last year, signified by the agreement in principle on a reciprocal access agreement. Both in their own strategic documents have focused on grey zone activities. What is the most effective areas where Japan and Australia can cooperate to counteract China's grey zone activities? He's posed the question to Ashley and Robert, but I think I'll go to Robert for a quick answer, and then we'll move on to a few questions on the Quad. So Robert, please.
So one of the things that struck me about the way that Australia's gone about this is and Ashley will presumably correct me, I got this wrong, was the sort of lack of coordination in its reaction towards what China's coercion with other like-minded countries in the region. So, for example, with cyber attacks and so on, or with the import issues and so on. And I always thought there's a very strong case for much more coordination between the like-minded. So, in Australia's case, with South Korea, for example, and Japan. And I think sort of building these coalitions, and I think Japan is absolutely right to be pushing this, because clearly the smaller powers on their own can't stand up to the bigger powers, but if they work together, then they do have a lot of balance. I think that is one of the keys to increasing resilience across the board.
Thanks, Robert. Now a couple of questions on the Quad. We have a few. Let's start with James Crabtree's question, and of course James is Executive Director of the IISS. How optimistic are the speakers that the Quad will be an effective balance against China, and in which direction do you think the Quad will go next? I think I'll pose this question to Kanti. I think it's we saw the Quad come out with a blast this year with its statement that it would cooperate on vaccines. The United States and Japan would pay for them, India would produce them, and Australia would distribute them. But of course, we've seen things take quite a downturn with developments in India, not least with respect to COVID. So on the question that James poses, how effective a balance against China would the Quad be, and in which direction will the Quad go next? So that's one. And then a follow-up from James, from John Chipman, who's, of course, the Director General of the IISS. Is the Quad a potentially inclusive and open structure? What would the thoughts of India and Australia be if either the UK or France or both sought, as part of the Indo-Pacific tilt, to join the grouping? And that can be either for Kanti or Ashley. So 2 questions on the Quad to start off with.
Yeah, let me just begin with some Indian attitudes towards the Quad. I mean, I think certainly India is more interested in the Quad than FOIP, which I think, as was said, is more economically oriented, related to connectivity and those kinds of things, and perhaps non-traditional security, whereas I think India sees the Quad more as the military wing. So, but having said that, India has a certain degree of ambivalence towards the Quad, and this comes out of several kinds of concerns or calculations. One is, of course, how far does India want to go in teaming up with these countries? How much would it provoke China and precipitate a problem, a deepening of the problem with China? I think the other problem is there are all kinds of contradictions with the Americans, somewhat related to what Delhi sees as an American preoccupation with the Pacific rather than the Indian Ocean. And I think India is more into the Quad for its Indian Ocean kind of opening rather than the Pacific preoccupation. So I think that's another problem. There are other kinds of contradictions with the Americans: Pakistan, Afghan policy, relations with Russia, and so on. So I think India always has a degree of kind of trepidation about how things might get linked up that might affect its participation in the Quad, issues that are outside the region. And I think likewise with Japan and even Australia, I think there are contradictions over various things. Some of them relate to things that have nothing to do very much with strategic issues here. They may relate more to social and political and economic things. So I think the general Indian hope or fantasy would be that it free rides as much as possible in the Quad, while really using the Quad to kind of suggest to the Chinese, if you push us too hard, here's something that we'll completely defect to, rather than just flirt with. And I think that's the Quad could increase India's bargaining room, and perhaps each of the members of the Quad has something like that view, which is messaging the Chinese that the Quad is useful. It's not an alliance. It's not NATO. But don't push us beyond the point, because we might turn it into something like that. And I think that's the kind of use of the Quad, I think, is probably the most likely ahead. And just one word very quickly, and then pass it on to others. I think India recently has started reaching out to the EU countries more than before, and the 3 major ones, that is the UK, France, and Germany, and is very hopeful that they will all show their naval flags more and more in the Indian Ocean and Pacific. And so I think in terms of the inclusivity of the Quad, I think India would probably be fairly open to having them more and more in it. Now, the one constraint, of course, is that in all of this, India also keeps an eye on ASEAN and its sensitivities, and it's very aware that ASEAN has its own difficulties with FOIP and the Quad, and it doesn't want to alienate ASEAN. So I think India is playing a very fine hand, and I think as Drew and perhaps others have gestured at, All these four Quad powers have to keep an eye on ASEAN's kinds of concerns about the development of the Quad and its greater inclusivity. So a fine game for everyone. Short conclusion, I think the Quad will grow, and I think it may grow in terms of its inclusivity, but it will be a slow process, and I think everyone will be trying to signal China more than anything else about this kind of wheel defect to something worse if you push us too hard.
So first Drew, and then Ashley, for your views, Ashley, on whether or not Australia as a Quad member would be open to the UK or France or both being part of the Quad grouping. Drew, ASEAN's view in the Quad, very quickly.
So I think ASEAN is ambivalent about it at best, but I think maybe what's more interesting would be a U.S. perspective, and I think the U.S. Default setting on foreign policy is essentially partnership, and I wouldn't see the U.S. necessarily as rejecting other partners, and I think they'd embrace inclusivity, but I think the U.S. focus would be on results-oriented. So rather than a symbolic do-nothing organization, they really want it to be an organization that can tackle these big issues, such as climate change or the pandemic. So I think there'd be room for France, the UK, Germany, South Korea to participate in Quad activities. And you could, predicting the future is difficult, but you could foresee, Quad plus frameworks that would include a Quad plus ASEAN or Quad plus Korea or Quad plus other partners who can jump in on areas that they see a common interest, whether that's climate change, whether that's maritime security, whether that's fisheries enforcement or other economic issues that suit them. And I think that's the diversity that the Quad brings. But as long as it's outcomes oriented and not just a talk shop, that I think it maintains its value.
Thanks, Drew. Ashley?
Look, I think that with the increasing amount of security cooperation partnerships between Australia and European countries, notably the French, the British and the Germans, the government would of course look fondly on any initiative to create Quad plus agendas or Quad plus mechanisms in the region on a range of specific regional issues. But look, I think the broader point about it is this. The Quad is absolutely enjoying a renaissance at the moment, but the rhetoric significantly outstrips the reality of what it can and is likely to be in the short term, in my view. Take Australia and the United States. These two countries that are close allies enjoying the 70th anniversary of the alliance this year are still not able to really do combined military strategy at a bilateral level. Yet we are not able to undertake industrial collaboration in an integrated way for even defense technologies, let alone other things, and we are the closest of allies. So for the Quad agenda, as it was announced at the Leaders Summit earlier this year, to have critical technologies as a forward agenda for it over the balance of this year and into the future, or for things like climate change, again, where the positions of certain countries are very different to each other, to me is a diffusion, a dilution of what the Quad should be about. So if you return the Quad back to a sort of maritime security primary purpose, I think there you can absolutely see both an agenda and a way forward for intensification of, let's say, anti-submarine warfare exercises and operations potentially between the Quad countries. There are already 6 ASW exercises that take place amongst Quad countries at a trilateral level, so linking them up quadrilaterally is no stretch. If you're taking something of that nature as the focus of the Quad, then I think on that issue and other issues as specific as ASW are places and avenues for bringing in 5th and 6th and 7th country coalitions when the time is right and when those countries have a similar interest. But I think the short answer here is that it will be really horses for courses when it comes to the Quad's expansion going forward.
Thanks. And here, the next question is for Sarah, but it's from Alex Neil, who's from Alexander Neil Consulting. He was a former Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellow at IISS as well. So warm welcome to Alex. It's nice to hear from you. His question is, how is the HMS Queen Elizabeth mission to the Indo-Pacific or is the HMS Queen Elizabeth mission to the Indo-Pacific an extension of NATO concerns towards the China challenge? Sarah?
I think you can certainly frame it in that way, and the UK will be seeking to do so. But of course, it's also an extension of the UK's interest in positioning itself as a persistent presence with a persistent interest in the region. And I think that's primarily the issue lens through which we should be seeing this, albeit that clearly it will be linking up with key bilateral partners who happen to be NATO global partners as well. I mean, I think the EU is the UK rather, is basically looking for every opportunity to actually put some substance on the declared tilt. This, of course, mission by the HMS Elizabeth has been long planned prior to the declaration of the Indo-Pacific tilt, but it does put obviously a nice lens on it. Other things apart from the HMS Elizabeth we should see, there's not just activity going on in the Eastern Indian Ocean, but also in the Western Indian Ocean. I think it was Kanti saying that that India was very keen on partners and allies noting the Indian section of the Indian bit of the Indian Pacific as well as the Asian bit of the Indian Pacific, and that I think there's something to watch there as well with what the UK is doing. First of all, most obviously with the Indian Ocean Commission, where it's looking for smaller regional organizations where it can develop closer partnerships too. Clearly, we've just been talking about aspirations at some point to partner or join more closely with the Quad, but there are several stepping stones of organizations that the UK will be looking at before then. And that, I think, includes the Western Indian Ocean with the Indian Ocean Commission, and then in time, albeit more complicated, the Indian Ocean Rim Association as well, albeit that that's obviously a little bit more of a difficult challenge with the membership and diversity that's involved in that.
Thanks, Sarah. I think the final question that we'll have time for this evening is from Catherine Hill from the Financial Times, and it's a question for Robert. Robert, just how far do you expect Japan to go in considering Taiwan in its security posture? How much concrete planning and preparation is Japan likely to do in its alliance with the United States for a Taiwan contingency? And what, in concrete terms, would Japan's role be? So not an easy question, Robert.
Let's go out with a bang then. Great question on that one. Of course, the changes that Japan has made, legal and other changes, are around allowing Japan to be more active, but if there's a threat to Japan's survival. So I think the key thing if we have a Taiwan contingency would be for Japan to calibrate, and presumably China will be also calibrating this, how much of what would be going on in that area would be existential for Japan, and that would define how much Japan could do. I think that Japan's recent comments on Taiwan are highly significant. Okay, it's clear that we don't know what Japan can do, and given all the constraints, whatever Japan could do would have to be decided on the day, as it were. But saying that that Japan attaches importance to the stability in the Taiwan Strait does commit Japan to a certain course of action if anything were to happen. So it is quite a significant change of posture. This also goes hand in glove, of course, with the increased Chinese activity around the disputed Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. And really, if you look at the charts about Chinese territorial needling in the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, it is very, very intense, of course. And obviously the situation has been, the tensions have risen further with China's new Coast Guard law. So lots of tension around there that I think everybody needs to be watching, but also very interesting, I think, how Japan is responding to this and its sort of greater elevation, willingness, if you like, to express concern.
Thanks so much, Robert. I'm afraid that brings to a close today's panel. I hope that the discussion and the chapters within the Asia-Pacific Regional Security Assessment will only be the start of ever more fruitful discussions on the strategic present, and future of the Asia-Pacific. I'd like to thank all the authors of the Regional Security Assessment, including those that were not able to join us today, our speakers who were able to join us both virtually as well as in the room, Ashley, Robert, Sarah, Drew and Kanti, and all of you who've joined us from home for joining us. I'm so glad that you've been able to share the last hour and a bit with me. I hope to see many of you in person soon. Do take care. Good night and good day.